Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about your Susan Sontag reading for this week regarding the pain of others. For April, what is this date? 15th or 16th? I had you all read the latter half, more than the latter half of this book from chapter 4 on, I believe. Or chapter 3, excuse me, chapter 3 to the end. I'm going to work through a couple of the points she raises in the first part of this reading, really the middle part of the book, and then when we talk on Thursday, I will plunge into some of the latter themes and discussions. So, the larger theme of this book is pain, of course, and depictions of pain, photographic depictions of pain, and how that is supposed to make people feel. The cover of your book here has a depiction of the war in Spain. I believe it was the Napoleonic War in Spain, which caused a lot of casualties. And that is a French soldier looking on as someone is hanging on a tree. And Goya thought that he was doing service to the war through these depictions by calling attention to the atrocities and, in depicting them, saying effectively, look how horrific this is. And of course, he was an illustrator. Those are illustrations, but then photography, Sontag tells us, has a greater claim to that message, which means to say that when photographs of war emerged, the photographers imagined even more strongly that these graphic images of suffering would most absolutely cause people aversion to war. But that is not, of course, that is not necessarily the case, of course. She tells us here in chapter 3 that one problem with depictions of suffering is that it may not stoke the right emotion. When people see images of suffering, this may just as well incite bloodlust, or rather, I should say, people will seek out such images for a different reason altogether. Humans have an appetite for showing bodies in pain. This is on page 41. This is, of course, very old, this phenomenon. We see it in plentiful abundance in entertainment media today. But throughout history, humans have always convened for public executions or to watch, the gladiator fights for entertainment. Bloodlust is a very old human attraction, and so it's hardly the case that people will see images of war and feel specifically moral outrage over the suffering. They may feel a kind of attraction to look at the images of gore. She notes a difference between painting and photography in that one makes a painting, but a person takes a photo. An artist makes a painting, and a photographer takes a photograph. This is on page 46. And she thinks that the implications of this language are pretty strong, but they're which suggests that the painter, I guess, is more active and the photographer is passive. The photographer is just recording what, is real, objective reality. And she thinks that the implications of this language are misleading. On page 46, she tells us, in the middle of the page, it's always the image that someone chose. To photograph is to frame, and to frame is to exclude. Sorry, I didn't set this quote up. This is about photography. Let me back up a little bit. But the photographic image, even to the extent that it is a trace, cannot be simply a transparency of something that happened. It is always the image that someone chose to photograph. It is always the image that someone chose. To photograph is to frame, and to frame is to exclude. So the point is there is a kind of making element in photography as well. The artist chooses what to take a picture of and what not to take a picture of. The artist chooses what to focus on and what not to focus on. And this leads her to conclude that everyone is a literalist when it comes to photographs. everyone is a literalist when it comes to photographs. That's a very powerful statement on 47. I take this to mean that, what she's interested in here is not only the intention of photographers, but the reception of the audience and the presumptions that the audience has. The audience receives a photograph in a different way from a painting. In other words, the audience receives a photograph as an accurate recording of reality, which just captures what it sees, and the audience ignores the kind of artistry and the decision making that goes into that. Everyone is a literalist when it comes to photos means that everyone thinks that a photograph is just a literal recording of events. Good. She tells us in the next section of photography, conveying the ills of war. This is a recent development. It started rather with celebrating and glorifying war. And, we're going way back now, but she says the first time photography diverged from glorifying war and to glimpsing casualties was during the American Civil War. And this is where she mentions Matthew Brady, the celebrated photographer of the Civil War. I have posted a link to a collection of his works on your Canvas page, so you can take a look at what he was doing. And about his aim or intent, she said, in capturing these images, she said that he felt a, quote, duty to record, a duty to record. He was in service of conveying realism. This is on page 52. He saw himself in service of conveying realism, and yet, what Sontag points out is that that Brady's images were not as realistic as they suggest. In fact, many of the most famous ones were staged. Brady went around moving the bodies, moving around the soldiers in order to get a certain effect that he wanted, taking advantage, if you will, of the literalism of the audience. That the audience thinks that this is going to be a literal creation or reproduction of reality. What's surprising, she says, is not that so many of the best remembered photographs were staged, but that we are typically surprised or disappointed to learn this. And here's what she says about this on page 55. This is at the bottom. We want the photographer to be a spy in the house of love and of death, and those being photographed to be unaware of the camera, off guard. No sophisticated sense of what photography is or can be will ever weaken the satisfactions of a picture of an unexpected event seized in mid-action by an alert photographer. There is a presumption to objectivity, and that is what we yearn. That is our special demand of photography, that it shows things as they are in themselves, independent human influence, independent of the influence of perception. People will behave differently if they feel they're being watched or their images are captured. And people appreciate photography, she argues, as being the most perfect access to catching people in those unexpected moments. And we can catch them in their candor. Moving on, she shares a curious quote a few pages later, where she discusses how photographs were seen as conveying the reality of war in superior fashion, and she quotes a New York Times report on Brady's exhibit of the photos of Antietam. Antietam was one of the most gruesome Civil War battles fought here in Maryland, near Frederick in the western part of the state. On page 62, here's a quote from the New York Times, middle of the page. The living that throng Broadway cared little, perhaps, for the dead at Antietam. but we fancy they would jostle less carelessly down the great thoroughfare, saunter less at their ease, where a few dripping bodies, fresh from the field, laid along the pavement. There would be a gathering up of skirts and a careful picking of way. And on the next page at the bottom, she says, new demands are made on reality in the era of cameras. The real thing may not be fearsome enough, and therefore needs to be enhanced or reenacted more convincingly. And she points out that one of the earliest war one of the first newsreels of battle was Teddy Roosevelt's charge at San Juan Hill. And the newsreel that was circulated to the American public was actually a staging of that charge. It was not the charge itself. Photos are not good enough. That's what this New York Times article suggests, that the photos, they're still not enough. They're not realistic enough. They're still deficient. They're still too distant, removed, or antiseptic. And it seems that the kind of realism that obviously it doesn't seem, it is obvious that the realism the New York Times is referencing here in 62, dripping bodies fresh from the field, these are an impossible, this kind of realism is an impossible standard or an impossible ideal. And this is all the more impossible, or I should say, this has made the charge, the demands on photography even more difficult, given how war has changed. She talks here around page 67 about, she says, this is a quote on page 66, war making and picture taking are congruent activities. War making and picture taking are congruent activities. Congruent, meaning they go together. The way I understand this quote is to say that the technology of both changes in tandem, and this makes me think of I'm going to read a quote from her on page 67. She says in the middle of 67, the preferred current American way of war making has expanded on this model. Television, whose access to the scene is limited by government controls and by self-censorship, serves up the war as images. The war itself is waged as much as possible at a distance, through bombing, whose targets can be chosen on the basis of instantly relayed information and visualizing technology from continents away. The daily bombing operations in Afghanistan in late 2001 and early 2002 were directed from U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida. The aim is to produce a sufficiently punishing number of casualties on the other side while minimizing opportunities for the enemy to inflict any casualties at all. She writes this book just before the widespread use of drones, which was President Obama's favorite tool in the war on terror. And it's easy to see why drones are preferred politically. They inflict little damage on the home troops and make it easier for government to continue to go to war. It's harder for government to go to war when the nation has more stake in the game, literally more soldiers on the ground. But when soldiers are removed from combat, where they will be casualties, this makes it easier for the public to tolerate war. And I think that's one of the major reasons that the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror has dragged on for so long, and the country hardly feels like it's at war, because we do it through drones. Drones, the drone pilots, their base is in the States, and they are waging war half a globe away. And if you've ever seen this drone footage, it is very remote. You're seeing, tiny figures on a screen. You don't see up close what's going on. Her contention is that the technology of war in this respect has kind of disabled the power of photography, its traditional role in times of war. Whereas In Vietnam, photography had ample evidence of the conflict and the toll it was, levying on American soldiers. That is hardly the case in the age of drones. In fact, photographers hardly bother to get on the ground in Pakistan and take pictures of the victims. We don't even know the victims. They're hardly human at all. Yet I do remember an interesting quote from a drone pilot. Interestingly enough, there are about half of the pilots right now in the U.S. Air Force are trained for drones, which is very interesting. There's some really interesting debates that have arisen. There was an interesting debate a few years ago about whether drone pilots should get medals of honor. Well, are they really in combat? They're killing people, but they're not exposing themselves. And yet there are also plenty of cases of drone pilots suffering PTSD. One pilot described his involvement this way. He said, you say that my relationship to the victims is distant, but it's actually extremely intimate, because a drone pilot has to keep an eye on their target for a long period of time and start to know their habits inside out, and hopefully know their family as well, because they sit and they wait and they watch until the family leaves and the victim is all alone, and then they obliterate the house. So this pilot was arguing that actually I get to know my victim very well, even better perhaps than in traditional combat conditions. She calls this the era of telecontrolled warfare, and there is no going back, really. This is the future for countries that can afford drones. She also points out the imperative of good taste, which impels us to avoid showing pictures that are too grisly. And she gives the example of the 9/11 coverage. She finds this imperative, the good taste imperative, puzzling. And I mentioned this last week, that I also find it kind of puzzling, and the reason being that our culture is otherwise saturated with grisly images. About a month ago, I saw the movie, the new Tarantino movie. Actually, he's always the perfect example for grisliness. But his new movie about the Manson killings, or I should say, the Manson murderers who were killed by Brad Pitt, and the violence at the end of that movie is pretty astonishing. Why is it that we tolerate seeing that, but we won't tolerate seeing, for example, she talks again about that severed hand. The photo of the severed hand at 9/11. We won't tolerate that. We might tolerate it if it's, I think what she wants to say, and I think she, rightfully so, that we won't tolerate a hand if it's white. If it's a different skin color, we may tolerate it more. But more on that in a little bit. She says that we risk losing out on a lot when we omit pictures due to good taste. And that would be one reason to consider showing the hand. And that's a question for you to consider. What is lost when we refuse to show the severed hand? I might also ask, what is gained? What is gained from showing that severed hand? She talks a lot about, on this issue of omitting photos out of respect for the family of the dead. She talks a lot about the example of Daniel Pearl, who is an American-Israeli journalist who was killed in 2002, I believe, by a faction in Pakistan that was allied with Al-Qaeda, and they beheaded him. And this video was made of his beheading, and it was sent to the press, to media outlets in the West, but it was never shown. And she thinks that, this decision to omit has a wide impact. This is what she says on 69. Bottom of the page says, the video was quickly taken offline. Notably, both sides treated the 3.5 minutes of horror only as a snuff film. Nobody could have learned from the debate that the video had other footage, a montage of stock accusations. For instance, images of Ariel Sharon, the Israeli prime minister, sitting with George W. Bush at the White House, Palestinian children killed in Israeli attacks, that it was a political diatribe and ended with dire threats and a list of specific demands, all of which might suggest that it was worth suffering through, if you could bear it. To confront better the particular viciousness and intransigence of the forces that murdered Pearl, it is easier to think of the enemy as just a savage who kills than holds up the head of his prey for all to see. This is a powerful conclusion here. It is easier to think of the enemy as just a savage who kills and holds up heads of his prey for all to see. In other words, what was omitted or what was lost out of taste here was any kind of rationalization on the part of the perpetrators. And it's much easier to just brush them off as evil savages if we don't give them coverage, right? That's what coverage can do. Sontag notes that our dead, and there has long been that with our dead there's long been a prohibition against showing the naked face. This is a similar point. But there is no similar prohibition with the dead from remote places. I think this is her point of saying that, we are happy to show dead bodies of foreigners, but we will not show, as I was saying last week, the American media is reluctant to show the dead bodies of our own casualties. And she makes a big deal about this. And she says that, we expect these kinds of atrocities. What is the impact of this? The impact is that we expect atrocities in other countries around the world, and in the third world, for example, but we don't expect these kind of atrocities perpetrated on our own or by our own hands. And a related note to Daniel Pearl, at the time the video of the beheading was brushed off as savage, and this is not something we need to show because this is unbecoming of American tastes. It's easy to disqualify the message because of the nature of the crime. And yet, the U.S. military, even recently, is guilty of similar horrors. The most famous example I can think of is in the early 1990s in the first war in Iraq. The Iraqi forces were retreating from Kuwait on this highway through the desert, and they were kind of a sitting duck, and the U.S. military obliterated them. They basically torched them all, and the images, though I've only seen them in snippets, were quite horrible. These were, burnt corpses in cars and trucks. And I have a friend who was served in that war, and he will not talk about what he's seen, but I believe one of the things he witnessed was the carnage on that highway. So, it's easy to dismiss the savages for beheading, and yet we are guilty of similar atrocities, and so it's not fair. It's not fair that we, there's very important and specific political impact in denying coverage of some things. I guess ideally we would see both. We would see the Daniel Pearl video, but we'd also see the highway with the charred corpses of the Iraqis. But then that leads to questions we're going to talk about on Thursday, which is, then you start to get an image overload, and is the impact of those images is diminished as there is this overload. But she suggests that there is a kind of racism here, that we are too willing to show and see images of the dead from other places, in particular dark-skinned bodies, but not our own. And she talks a bit about this collection of pictures by a photographer named Salgado. This is on the page 70s, where she talks about these are migration pictures of migrants suffering from all over the world. Here's what she says in the middle of 79. She says, Making suffering loom larger by globalizing it may spur people to feel they ought to care more. It also invites them to feel that the sufferings and misfortunes are too vast, too irrevocable, too epic to be much changed by any local political intervention. With a subject conceived on this scale, compassion can only flounder and make abstract, but all politics, like all history, is concrete. Well, here she's already talking about the point I was making just a second ago, that, if you overwhelm the audience with images of carnage and suffering, this, as she puts it, compassion may flounder in those circumstances as well. And of course, this leads to the question, what should effective photo documentation be? What should it involve? And it leads her to say that it might be more correct morally to make the spectacular not spectacular, to show only the humdrum. Photographers have tried to use shock, as she says, to gain attention over people's consciousness. But it might be more morally correct to make the spectacular less spectacular, and to show how suffering is a daily occurrence for people and how it integrates into their daily lives. She also considers the ability of photos to shock, and to illustrate this, she takes up the case of the Canadian cigarette packs. This is in page 81. I'm going to wind this down here. But she says that I often talk about these cigarette packs in other classes. I think I remember the first time I saw them. They're pretty remarkable. If a cigarette pack in Canada is almost entirely covered by the most the goriest, gruesome pictures of diseased lungs and teeth and aborted fetuses. It's pretty rough. And they did this, of course, in order to try and discourage smoking. I have to say, in Montreal, where I went, one of the places I've been in Canada, that did not seem to have that desired effect, and we could certainly talk about why that is. And this leads her to say that, people, they want to weep and they want to feel with others, but they don't really want to feel horror. There are some things that people would like to forget, and of itself, photography is powerless to make us remember. Because a photographer can choose not to depict certain images. As she puts it, there are memories that few have cared to claim. There are memories that few have cared to claim. And here's a nice quote about that on page 85 in the middle. It says, "The familiarity of certain photographs builds our sense of the present and immediate past. Photographs lay down roots of reference and serve as totems of causes. Sentiment is more likely to crystallize around a photograph than around a verbal slogan. And photographs help construct and revise our sense of a more distant past, with the posthumous shocks engineered by the circulation of hitherto unknown photographs. Photographs that everyone recognizes are now a constituent part of what a society chooses to think about or declares that it has chosen to think about. It calls these ideas memories, and that is, over the long run, a fiction. Strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a collective memory, part of the same family of spurious notions of collective guilt, but there is collective instruction." Photographs can be part of that collective instruction about what we should remember about the past. And then that is our way to remember that past. As she puts it, photos can play a key role in instructing a society what to memorialize. And I gave you some examples of the iconic photos from the Vietnam War. That's what we were chose to memorialize about that war. The black and the white soldier approaching each other. So there's a kind of racial equality in the suffering of that war. There's the woman putting flowers into the barrels of the National Guard rifles, right? That's the peace movement. And there's the dead student protester on the campus of Kent State, memorializing the student protests and the frustration of those protests. So I guess the point being here that you can't remember everything. There's going to be a narrative, a specific narrative that is memorized, that is remembered. And I guess under other circumstances, we would simply call that history. And photography, can be decisive in what will count as our history. Good. That brings us to page 87. I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick it up on Thursday. Okay. See you later. Bye.